The cracked desk felt colder than ever beneath her trembling hand. Jessica, 25, stood frozen in front of the closed casket, unable to breathe. Her eyes locked onto the worn leather-bound lesson book clutched in her fingers. Mr. Thomas's handwriting still smudged across its pages. Around her a church heavy with silence and dust. The ting of a distant wall clock carved each second like a blade. A tear rolled down her cheek, landing on the old desk salvaged from their classroom, now placed at the altar. He was gone. And with him, everything she never got to say. She blinked hard. Behind her, murmurs and faint organ music filled the space as people slowly filed in. No one else cried. No one else understood. "You'll understand one day," Mr. Thomas had once said to her after a shouting match. She didn't understand then. But standing here with grief clamping around her ribs like a vice, she wasn't so sure anymore. Maybe he had seen something in her. Something she couldn't. Maybe that day had already arrived. Jessica sat in the very back pew, arms folded tight across her chest, her knees pressed together. She didn't belong among the mourners exchanging pleasantries, whispering nostalgia, as if Mr. Thomas had been just another teacher. They laughed softly, recalling pranks and pop quizzes. But none of them knew. Not really. Jessica kept her head low, eyes flicking from face to face, their memories sanitized, safe. For her, Mr. Thomas had been something else entirely. An antagonist, a drill sergeant, and maybe, deep down, her only believer. As the pastor droned on about the impact of a life well lived, Jessica's mind flashed back to detention halls and chalk dust. To the day he said, "You're wasting your life," and she screamed that he knew nothing. But he had known. He'd seen through her walls long before she ever admitted they were there. Back then, she thought he hated her. Jessica remembered how he always called her out, late assignments, skipped classes, eye rolls. He never let her slip past unnoticed. "Miss Clarke," he'd say with sharp emphasis, "you're smarter than this, but you'd rather play dumb." She rolled her eyes every time. She had enough going on. Fighting at home, dodging her mom's boyfriend's fists, and trying to survive without losing her mind. But Mr. Thomas never stopped pressing. He never gave up, even when she spat venom. The last time she saw him, she'd slammed the door in his face outside the guidance counselor's office. Now that door could never reopen. At the front of the church, Jessica rose, hesitating before walking toward the casket. Each step felt like trudging through wet cement. She stood over it, staring at the smooth wooden lid. "I hated you," she whispered. Her voice shook. "But you were right." She placed the lesson book down gently on top, like an offering. "You saw me when I couldn't see myself." The silence was her only answer. A breeze stirred from a nearby vent, rustling the pages of the book. One stopped halfway open, revealing a quote scrawled across the margin, "Truth cuts before it heals." Jessica smiled bitterly. He had been right about that too. As Jessica turned to walk away, something shifted inside her. The grief didn't leave, but something else entered. A sense of responsibility. Of unfinished business. Mr. Thomas had fought for her, even when she pushed him away. Now, maybe it was her turn. She took one last look at the desk. A symbol of who she had been. And maybe, just maybe, who she could become. She didn't know what was next, but for the first time in a long while, she wanted to find out. Jessica walked back down the aisle, her head slightly higher, her steps firmer. Behind her, the book rested like a silent promise. Jessica stood in the attic of her childhood home, where every beam seemed to sag with the weight of old memories. Dust clung to the stale air, stirred by her footsteps on warped wooden planks. She hadn't set foot in this space since high school, yet the clutter hadn't changed. Boxes of forgotten toys, faded holiday decorations, a rusting bike with a flat tire. In the corner, half covered by a moth-eaten tarp, was a weathered blue storage crate. She knelt, pulling it toward her, heart beating harder with each drag. As she peeled back the lid, a red string caught her eye. Beneath it lay a thick stack of envelopes, neatly bound, her name written across each one in unmistakable cursive. Mr. Thomas's handwriting. Jessica froze. These weren't school records. These were letters. Letters he'd written and never sent. A personal archive of hope, regret, and something else she couldn't name yet. Her throat tightened. Why would he keep writing, after she'd left him behind? Jessica sat cross-legged in the attic, the crate beside her, sunlight forming golden slants across the floor. One by one, she untied the red string and opened the letters. Mr. Thomas's penmanship hadn't changed. Precise, thoughtful, like he was still lecturing between the lines. "I know you think I gave up on you," one letter began. "But the truth is, I never could." Jessica blinked through a wave of tears. Another letter recounted the day she defended a younger student in the hallway, a moment she'd forgotten, but he hadn't. He wrote as if he'd been storing all her hidden victories, refusing to let them vanish. He described her as bright, stubborn, wounded. "You are not your environment," he wrote. "You are the exception." Jessica pressed her hand over her heart. The attic suddenly felt too small. These weren't letters of closure. They were breadcrumbs, each one leading her back to the person he always believed she could become. Underneath the final envelope, Jessica found a thick, black leather-bound journal. Its corners were frayed, the spine cracked from years of use. She opened it slowly, the pages brittle but intact. The first page held just her name, Jessica Clarke, centered, underlined. Below that, the student I failed to reach, or maybe the one who needed time. The handwriting was unmistakable. Mr. Thomas had been documenting everything. Her moods, her defiance, the way she stared out the window when she thought no one was watching. "She's not angry," he wrote on one page. "She's drowning. And no one's thrown her a rope yet." Jessica's jaw trembled. Each entry felt like a window into a time she thought no one noticed. But he had. Again and again he had. And somehow, through those pages, he hadn't just been her teacher. He'd been a silent witness to her pain and her potential. As the afternoon light dimmed, Jessica clutched the journal against her chest. Her mind swirled with words from a man long gone, words that had waited years for her to be ready. Near the bottom of the crate, she found one last envelope. It was smaller, aged more heavily than the rest, and sealed. Across the front, in the same looping script, was a single word: truth. Her breath caught as she broke the seal. Inside was just one page, but its message leveled her. "We don't teach for applause," it read. "We teach for the moment our students outgrow us. My bet is still on you." Her eyes filled. The attic around her seemed to disappear. She had spent years proving him wrong, only to find out he had never stopped believing she'd prove him right. Even now, even in death, he had the final word. And somehow, it didn't feel like an ending. It felt like a beginning. That night, back in her old bedroom, Jessica couldn't stop rereading the letters. She had pushed Mr. Thomas away, spit fire at him, slammed every emotional door. But he had stayed. Not physically, but in faith and effort, in pages no one else would ever read. The house creaked with old memories, but tonight, it also whispered possibility. Jessica opened a blank notebook. For the first time in years, she began to write. Not a lie, not a journal entry she'd abandoned, but a letter. To herself. She wrote about anger, about loneliness, about the betrayal of being told you're worthless, and the haunting echo of someone insisting you're not. The words flowed messy, uneven, but true. And when she finished, she didn't cry. She didn't collapse. She breathed. A long, shaking breath. As if something inside her had unclenched. Like hope, not loud, but steady. The quiet kind that returns when you least expect it. Jessica stared at the worn application form, her fingers hesitating over the keyboard. It was the same college Mr. Thomas once arranged an interview for. Back then she laughed in his face, tore the invitation into pieces, and never looked back. Now, she couldn't stop thinking about it. She checked the deadline, 3 days left. Her stomach twisted. Was she too late? Was this even worth trying? Her heart thudded against her ribs as she clicked start. The questions hit her like a wall. Achievements, GPA, extracurriculars. She had none of that. But what she did have was a story. Raw, real, painful. Maybe, just maybe, that mattered too. Jessica began typing. Her fingers moved slowly at first, then faster, her voice finding shape in words she never thought she'd say. I failed. I quit, but I'm still here. This time, it wasn't about a second chance. It was about finally showing up for herself. She searched her closet for anything professional, finally pulling out a wrinkled blazer buried behind unused clothes. She practiced in the mirror, heart pounding. Tell me about yourself, she muttered. Why now? Her voice cracked. Because I wasn't ready before, she said to her reflection. But I am now. Her eyes didn't flinch this time. She stood taller. The girl who used to hide behind sarcasm and smirks was still there, but something had shifted. Jessica brushed her hair into a neat ponytail, wiped down her shoes, and packed the printed application. It wasn't just a college interview she was preparing for. It was the conversation she never had with Mr. Thomas. This time, she'd be ready to speak, to own her past, to walk in not as a victim of her circumstances, but as a woman building something from them. Jessica stood outside the admissions office, papers clutched in a trembling hand. Her breath fogged in the cold morning air. She glanced at the building, red brick, ivy crawling across its facade. The place hadn't changed. The only thing different was her. 7 years ago, she never made it past the steps. She'd thrown away the chance like it meant nothing. Now she could feel every ounce of that lost time pressing against her chest. But this wasn't about regret anymore. She crossed the threshold. Inside, the waiting room smelled like coffee and floor polish. She took a seat, knees bouncing, fingers drumming the armrest. A woman in a gray suit called her name. Jessica stood, chin up. This was it. Not redemption. Just a start. And this time, she wouldn't run. The office was quiet, warm, lined with books and degrees. The dean, an older woman with silver-rimmed glasses, offered a polite smile. I remember your name, she said. Jessica blinked. You do? The dean nodded. You were scheduled for an interview. Years ago. Mr. Thomas arranged it. The words hit like thunder. Jessica's voice dropped. I didn't show. The dean leaned forward. He believed in you. He asked me to hold the slot even when you didn't confirm. Jessica swallowed the lump in her throat. I'm not the same person anymore. The dean studied her face. Then tell me who you are now. Jessica exhaled slowly, pulling out her essay. Someone who finally listened. She placed the paper on the desk. For the first time, she didn't feel like an imposter. She felt seen. Jessica left the office with her coat wrapped tight around her and tears welling in her eyes. But this time, they weren't from fear. They were release. As she stepped back into the open air, she glanced up at the sky. A pale sun peeked through the clouds, cold but steady. She sat on a nearby bench, journal in her lap, flipping to the last entry Mr. Thomas had written about her. Jessica Clarke, it read. The storm won't last forever. She smiled through wet eyes. Maybe it wouldn't. Maybe it had already passed. She pulled out a pen and scribbled underneath his words. I believe you now. With that, she closed the journal and held it to her chest. This wasn't just about school. It was about healing. Rewriting the story she'd once thought was finished. And for the first time, she wasn't afraid of what came next. The school hallway hadn't changed much. Same scuffed tile floors. Same fluorescent lights humming above. Same smell of dust and teenage perfume. Jessica walked slowly past the lockers, her boots echoing softly. The walls, once lined with teenage cruelty and drama, now held framed awards and honor boards. She stopped outside the principal's office. Behind the glass, the same man sat, Principal Gaines, older now, but unmistakable. She knocked gently. He looked up, puzzled for a moment, then stood. Jessica Clarke, he said, surprised. I thought I'd seen a ghost. She smiled faintly. I need to talk to you. About Mr. Thomas. The principal waved her in without hesitation. The office felt smaller than she remembered. She sat down slowly, clutching the journal to her chest. I found his letters, his journal. He never gave up on me, did he? Principal Gaines shook his head. He never gave up on any of you, but especially not you. Inside the office, Jessica sat quietly as Principal Gaines reached into his filing cabinet and pulled out a yellowed folder. He asked me to keep this, he said. Said one day you'd come back. Jessica blinked in disbelief. The folder had her name written in marker across the front. She opened it and found printouts, recommendations, and an old transcript, highlighted and annotated by Mr. Thomas. Tucked inside was a sealed envelope labeled Contingency Plan. J.C. Jessica's hands trembled as she opened it. Inside was a letter addressed to the dean of a second college, a backup, one he'd contacted without her knowing. In case she misses the first one, he had written. She couldn't stop shaking. He hadn't just believed in her. He'd prepared for her failure. Not out of doubt, but out of faith that she'd eventually stand back up. He'd planned for her redemption long before she ever wanted it. Jessica turned the letter over, examining the signature, the looping final words. I believe she will become more than her pain. Her vision blurred again. Why did he try so hard for me? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Principal Gaines leaned back. Because you reminded him of someone. Himself, I think. He used to say the ones who push you away the hardest are often the ones praying you won't leave. Jessica closed the folder gently. I did everything wrong. Gaines smiled gently. And still, here you are. For the first time she didn't feel ashamed of her failures. They weren't dead ends. They were detours, messy, painful, but still leading somewhere. She stood slowly, her hands tighter around the folder now. Thank you, she said. But it wasn't just to Gaines. It was to the man who saw who she could be, and never stopped betting on her. Later that day, Jessica walked through the school's empty classroom corridor. She paused at room 214, Mr. Thomas's old classroom. The door was locked, but she leaned her head gently against it. The memories came rushing in, chalk dust in the air, his sharp voice cutting through noise, the way he always paused before saying her name. She whispered into the stillness, I get it now. Her voice cracked. You weren't trying to break me, you were trying to build me. She slid a folded copy of her essay under the door. On it she had scribbled in pen, I'm applying again. I'm not running this time. The hallway echoed around her, empty and endless. But for the first time, it didn't feel hollow. It felt sacred, like a cathedral built from memory and stubborn hope. She stood a little taller as she walked away. That evening, she sat at her kitchen table, journal beside her, letters spread out like pieces of a life she was just beginning to understand. She picked up the one labeled Truth again, rereading it slowly. My bet is still on you. The words didn't make her cry this time. They made her breathe deeper. She lit a small candle in a glass jar, something her therapist once told her to do when reclaiming hard spaces. This wasn't a ritual. It was a vow. She pulled out her laptop and opened a fresh document titled, The Legacy Project. Her fingers hovered over the keys. Then she began typing. This is for the ones who feel unseen. This is for the ones told they're worthless. This is for the one teacher who saw me before I did. Her fingers didn't stop this time. They flew. The past couldn't be undone, but it could be rewritten. And that's exactly what she was doing. Jessica stood outside a local youth center, watching teens drift in and out, shoulders slouched, eyes wary, faces she knew all too well. She had found the right place. It wasn't glamorous. The walls were chipped, the gate squeaked, and the windows wore years of grime. But inside was possibility. She walked through the doors, lesson plans clutched in hand. A volunteer coordinator greeted her, surprised but warm. We could really use someone like you, she said. Jessica nodded. I know. She was here to start something. A program just for kids like her. No lectures. No judgment. Just space. Support. Bite. A voice that didn't yell or coddle, but told the truth. Just like he had. That afternoon, she stood in front of a group of 10 teens. No one clapped. No one smiled. But no one left either. And in that silence, she knew she had begun. The classroom they gave her was small. 4 mismatched desks, a cracked whiteboard, and a single flickering light overhead. But Jessica made it hers. She taped quotes on the walls, rearranged chairs into a circle, and set out cheap notebooks like gifts. When the kids arrived, they eyed her with skepticism. One asked, "What are you?" Another failed teacher trying to fix us. Jessica smiled gently. "No, I'm someone who once needed this room as badly as you do." That answer bought her silence, which was better than laughter. She didn't try to impress them. She just showed up. Every session, she read a line from Mr. Thomas's journal, followed by one of her own. "Truth cuts before it heals," she said one day. A boy in the back muttered, "That's dumb." She grinned. "Is. Until it's not." A beat of silence followed. Then someone else said, "What's next?" She found herself echoing Mr. Thomas more often. His cadence, his principles, his challenges. But she did it her way. No lectures, no power plays. Just truth and presence. When one student stormed out mid-session, she didn't chase them. When another refused to speak, she left space. Slowly, they began to lean in. Jessica watched it unfold like muscle memory. A girl brought her own journal one day. A boy asked to stay after. Little by little, they cracked open. Jessica didn't ask them to share what hurt. She just let them see her scars and didn't hide the healing. She told stories, not about redemption, but about reality. Pain and survival. Shame and second chances. And every week, more of them came back. Not because they had to, but because they started to believe they might be worth the effort. Late one evening, after the students had gone, Jessica stayed behind, cleaning the room. On the whiteboard, a student had scribbled, "You don't talk like a teacher." Jessica smiled. She erased it slowly, leaving behind the faint outline. She didn't need to talk like a teacher. She just needed to be what Mr. Thomas had been for her, unshakably present. She sat down in one of the student chairs, exhausted but full. Outside, rain tapped gently on the windows. She pulled out the old journal and opened to a random page. If she ever gets it, really gets it, she won't just survive, she'll save others. Jessica exhaled. For so long she thought saving people meant perfect answers. But now she knew, it just meant showing up. Being a mirror. Holding space. She closed the book and whispered, "I get it now." This time, she didn't cry. She simply nodded. And stayed a little longer in the quiet. Jessica started a mentorship initiative called Legacy Circles. The name was quiet, but the work was loud. Teens started recommending their friends. A local paper ran a story. Donations trickled in. Her old school even reached out, asking if she'd speak. She said yes. And when she stood on that familiar stage, auditorium lights blinding, microphone shaking in her hand, she didn't recite a polished speech. She just told the truth. About being broken. About being seen. About the teacher who bet on her before she had anything to offer. "His belief didn't save me overnight," she said. "But it never left me. And one day, it caught up." The crowd was silent. One student stood and asked, "What if no one ever believes in you?" Jessica looked directly at her. "Then you believe in yourself first, and I'll believe in you second." The applause that followed wasn't loud, but it was honest. And that was enough. Months passed and Jessica's life transformed in quiet, meaningful ways. Her mornings began earlier, not with dread but with purpose. She made coffee, reviewed notes, packed her bag. No alarms needed anymore. She wanted to show up. Her classes at the community college were tough, every paper a battle, every exam a climb, but she fought through them with grit. Some days she cried in the car. Some nights she fell asleep over her books. But she never quit. Not once. The words from Mr. Thomas's letters stayed with her, stitched into every decision. You're allowed to start late, as long as you start. She studied beside teenagers who didn't know her past and professors who never asked. It felt good, starting over with no one expecting her to fail. Slowly, she began to see herself not as someone damaged, but someone in motion. And that, for the first time, felt like peace. One Thursday afternoon, while tutoring at the youth center, Jessica noticed a quiet boy sitting alone. He hadn't spoken in 3 sessions. She sat beside him without speaking, sliding her own notebook toward him. "Want to see how many mistakes I made this week?" she joked. He blinked, surprised, then piqued. The pages were full of scribbled-out sentences, corrections, side notes. "You write messy," he muttered. "I live messy," she said with a smirk. That was it, but he stayed for the whole session. The next week he brought his own notebook. The week after, he volunteered to read aloud. Jessica never praised him too loudly. She just nodded, let the silence affirm him. It was slow work, quiet work. But it was the same work someone had once done for her. She didn't need recognition. She only needed to know that something was shifting. That one more kid might walk out a little less invisible. Jessica was invited to a local educators panel. It felt surreal. She still didn't consider herself a professional. But she accepted. The theme was building bridges. When it was her turn to speak, she stood with a calm she hadn't felt in years. "You don't need a title to be a teacher," she said. "You just need to stay when everyone else leaves." The room was quiet. She told her story, not for pity, but for perspective. She spoke of the girl she used to be. The one teachers gave up on. The one Mr. Thomas never abandoned. "We aren't just preparing kids for tests," she said. "We're preparing them to believe they're worth something." The audience remained silent for a beat, then erupted into applause. Afterward, a young teacher approached her, eyes glassy. "Thank you. I needed to hear that." Jessica smiled and nodded. The work was being passed on, just as it should be. Later that night, Jessica visited the cemetery. It had been nearly a year since Mr. Thomas's funeral. The grass had grown thick around the headstone. She knelt, brushing away leaves, placing a folded note at its base. "You were right," she whispered. "I did make it out, and I'm not done." She sat there in silence, watching the sky shift into dusk. No grand revelations. No visions. Just a quiet peace. She opened the journal one last time, finding a blank page at the end. On it she wrote, "Your voice became mine." Her hand rested on the stone for a moment before she stood. As she walked back to her car, she felt it, like a tether finally loosened, not broken, but transformed. He had given her everything he could. And now, she was doing the same for others. That was the legacy. Not memory. Motion. Jessica returned home and opened her laptop. Her inbox pinged, an acceptance letter. She stared at the words for a long time. "We're pleased to welcome you." She laughed softly, then cried harder than she had in months. It wasn't just the college. It was the proof that she was no longer the girl who had sabotaged herself. She had faced every voice that once told her she couldn't, and answered with action. That night, she called a few of her students, told them she'd be gone a few days for orientation. One said, "You're gonna be the best kind of teacher, the kind that tells the truth." Jessica smiled. That's all she ever wanted. Not perfection. Just truth. She looked at her reflection in the laptop screen. Older, stronger, unfinished. And she whispered, "We made it." It wasn't the end of the road. But it was the moment she realized she was walking it, for real this time. The classroom buzzed softly with the shuffle of papers and low murmurs. Jessica stood at the front, marker in hand, writing a question on the whiteboard. What makes you valuable? Behind her, 20 students watched. Some slouched. Some stared blankly. But a few leaned forward, curious. She turned to face them, heart steady. This was her classroom now. Her rules. Her voice. Gone was the fear of being mocked, ignored, or dismissed. She didn't need to pretend. She didn't need to be anyone else. There's no wrong answer, she said. Just don't leave it blank. One student raised a hand slowly. Another began to scribble. She stepped back and let the silence stretch, something Mr. Thomas taught her. It's in the pause, he used to say. That's where the truth shows up. She smiled, watching as pens moved. It wasn't about answers. It was about the question, and who dared to answer it. Later that day, during lunch, Jessica sat under a tree outside the school, grading papers with a thermos beside her. A student approached, quiet, anxious, holding a wrinkled sheet. Can I show you something? Jessica nodded. The girl handed her a poem, handwritten and shaky. It was about feeling invisible. Jessica read it in silence. When she looked up, the student said, I didn't think I could write. But you said everyone has a voice. Jessica smiled softly. I'm glad you believed me. The girl asked, do you still write? Jessica thought for a moment, then nodded. Every day, even when it's messy. The girl grinned. Then maybe I'll try too. As she walked away, Jessica folded the poem and tucked it into her journal. Not to critique it. Just to keep it safe. This wasn't about saving anyone. It was about giving them back their own story. And honoring it. That evening, Jessica sat at her desk at home, surrounded by photos and lesson plans. She pulled out Mr. Thomas's journal, now worn and underlined in dozens of places. She turned to the last page, the one she'd left blank for months. With a steady hand she wrote, Your voice became my anchor. I didn't just survive, I built. She paused, then added, Thank you for not giving up when I did. She closed the book gently and placed it on her shelf next to her own journal. 2 stories. Woven together. One sparked the other. She glanced around her apartment, books stacked everywhere, sticky notes on the walls, mismatched mugs, and half-filled notebooks. A beautiful mess. A life being lived, fully. Not fixed. Not perfect. But honest. And hers. She lit a small candle near the window. Just like before. But this time, it wasn't for healing. It was for honoring. The school year ended with laughter and signed notebooks, students hugging goodbye and running for summer. Jessica stood in the empty classroom afterward, looking at the cleaned-out desks, the faint smell of pencil shavings and dry erase markers in the air. She walked between the rows slowly, running her fingers along the surfaces. On one desk, someone had carved, She listens. Jessica smiled. She sat down in the chair at the front. Mr. Thomas's old habit, and looked out at the silent room. You were right, she whispered. They do get it. Eventually. She thought of the girl with the poem. The boy who hadn't spoken for weeks, but finally did. The student who emailed her just to say, thank you. She stood up and erased the board one last time. Not out of erasure, but to make space. For whoever came next. She picked up her things. And walked forward. Jessica stood at the window of her new classroom in the city, sunlight streaming across the chalk-dusted floor. A group of students filed in, noisy, chaotic, full of energy. She turned to greet them, heart full. This was a new beginning. Another set of lives to touch. Another legacy to build. She remembered standing at that cracked desk all those years ago, full of shame and silence. Now she stood with purpose. As the students settled, she took a breath and said, You're not here to be perfect. You're here to become. A hush fell. One student looked up and asked, Become what? Jessica smiled softly. Whatever you choose. She looked out the window once more, sunlight warming her face. Somewhere she could still hear Mr. Thomas's voice, no longer haunting her, but echoing within. She closed her eyes for a moment and whispered, "I finally understand."